Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 331. We're continuing our new, as of this week, unit on democracy. And we are picking up where we left off because we're continuing with the discussion of Plato. This time around, we're going to be looking at Richard Kraut and his paper, Plato Against Democracy, a Defense. So Kraut is a professor of philosophy at Northwestern University, and he's an expert in both ancient philosophy and ethics. So there's definitely some ways in which we might be able to benefit from Kraut's expertise on this topic. So just to pick up a little bit from last time, we saw some significant criticisms of a democratic form of government in Book 8 of the Republic. So first, we got an objection to oligarchy, which also happens to be an objection to democracy and basically any non-aristocratic form of government. And that is this so-called piloting analogy. The thought is, if we let people steer ships on the basis of who is the most rich, we'd probably run that ship into the ground. So if we allowed a government to be run by the people who are most popular, rather than the people who are most skilled, we shouldn't expect them to govern successfully. Again, the important move in Plato's Republic is the city-state analogy, which suggests that a just man is like a just state, and a democratic state will be like the democratic man. So we see a criticism of democracy in seeing the alleged deficits in the character of a democratic man. So democracy treats all individuals as equal, while the democratic man treats their desires or their appetites as equal. So they can't distinguish between necessary and unnecessary appetites. Moreover, in a democratic state, there is necessarily a lack of respect for authority. So in the way that schools are run or families are administered, there is a lack of hierarchy. And for Plato, that in and of itself is an injustice, right? Because Plato's central idea of justice is that of having each individual doing the job that's specific to them. So the job that you fit in, as it were. And moreover, because there's every sort of association and every sort of person that's treated as equal in the democratic state, you're going to have a lot of volatility. So something that we see in a democratic state is disorder and unpredictability. That's going to lead to the descent into tyranny that Socrates describes. So we see a lot of these themes returning in Kraut's approximation of Plato's argument that he lays out. So let's run through it. It's got 6 premises and a conclusion. So the first idea is just that in every political community, the common good requires that certain roles be filled. So it requires that some people play the role of teacher, some people play the role of peacekeepers and firefighters. Maybe others have the role of leading. We need different people each doing their job in order to have a successful political community. Second, you see that those who play those roles should be qualified to do so. So we shouldn't have unqualified teachers, we shouldn't have unqualified police officers or doctors, heaven forbid. Because if we don't have, for instance, qualified teachers or doctors, they're not going to be able to help people and promote the common good. Third, ruling is a role that requires qualified practitioners. And because of that, there are qualifications one ought to have if one is to be good at political decision-making. So just like we don't want anybody to perform open-heart surgery on you, you don't want just anybody to be your president or your mayor. Then fifth, most citizens lack those qualifications for rule. Kraut further points out that we have support for 5 because that's what we should expect in democracies. Democracies don't require that people have the qualifications of what it takes to rule. So there will be little incentive for citizens to require the requisite knowledge and skill that it takes to do a good job of performing the skills required for good rulership. And so from that, we can conclude that the people, that is, most of the people, should not participate in political rule. So the thought here is that we should have an elite making decisions about how governance is done. And that's the only thing that we ought to do in order to promote the common good. That's Kraut's argument. So this is a hierarchical approach, right? We're going to give more power of rule and more political power to specific individuals. So this is going to be a hierarchical setup. Now, you might think that hierarchy in and of itself is a bad thing. You'll recall that Elizabeth Anderson suggested that what egalitarian political movements are all about is the dismantling of hierarchies, to have everyone meeting as equals. Well, Kraut, in his Platonic mood, suggests, well, hierarchy need not be a bad thing. There are many non-defective organizations that are not democracies. So universities, hospitals, and armies, for instance. So in the case of universities, it is not a matter of voting who gets to become a professor. We leave it up to the universities and departments themselves to decide who is qualified to fill those roles. And moreover, in a functioning university, there are certain individuals who have more power and more say-so as to how the institution is run from day to day than others. We can say similar things in hospitals and armies, that there are asymmetrical power relationships that go on in hierarchies. Now, there's a suggestion that might be made. Maybe we should treat governments as non-hierarchical, although we treat universities, hospitals, and armies as hierarchies. And the thought might be this: look, you're going to have to live under a government, but it's up to you how much you're going to associate with universities, hospitals, armies. You can join or not join these organizations. So the thought here would be that there's a distinction between an organization you have to be a part of, that you have a choice about entering into, as opposed to those you don't. But Kraut, I think, rightly points out that there are asymmetrical relations of hierarchy, where the fact that you didn't choose them isn't sufficient to explain the difference between the permissibility and non-permissibility of hierarchies. Because parents, for instance, can wield authority over their children. That's certainly a hierarchical and, by definition, paternalistic relationship. But it's not as if children are given any choice whether the parents that they have are the ones that they're going to have. You just get the parents that you luck into, maybe in a way that's analogous to the way you simply get the state that you're born into. So, with this in mind, Kraut suggests that this idea in support of hierarchy can be used to envision a better non-democratic way of setting up modern-day governments. So he says this: suppose that people were only allowed to vote between ages 50 and 60. The thought would be, by age 50, you have enough experience of the world, and before you're over 60, you haven't yet begun to experience any significant levels of cognitive decline. And that your political participation is contingent on your having enrolled in a special program that's designed to increase your cognitive functioning, your moral maturity, and your political understanding. So we might imagine that this is, an extremely long-term educational program that's set up to make people into leaders. And you would be restricted from engaging in this training if you had, for instance, psychopathic tendencies, or racism or xenophobia, any sort of unacceptable antipathy towards outsiders. So only people who make it through this extremely rigorous program of training, and it would involve gaining understanding of history, of politics, of philosophy, and a broader understanding of history and literature, perhaps. Also economics. So this would be an extremely rigorous program for potential leaders. And moreover, even within this system, there could be a system of checks and balances for leaders. So if they misbehave, they could be ousted, and so forth. Now, in this kind of situation, Kraut suggests that there would be no legal or economic barriers to leading or participating in political life. So everybody would have the option of engaging in this special program. But Kraut says that we should not call this a democracy because it's not ruled by the demos, it's not ruled by the many, instead it's ruled by the few. So if we required each participant in our political system to have this kind of special training, we'd be better off calling it aristocracy or at least Platonic democracy. So one thing that you might be wondering is this actually possible? Is this actually feasible? Well, we get this line of thought sometimes. We say that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others that have been tried. So Winston Churchill once said that. And the thought would be is that of the possible systems, democracy is the best system. Well, Kraut says that Platonic democracy isn't going to be tried anytime soon. He's not under any illusions about that. But just because it's not likely to ever be instituted there's not even a small likelihood of its ever being instituted. It doesn't mean it's impossible. And Kraut thinks that if Platonic democracy were instituted and promoted the public good better than democracy, then it would be a better form of government. Now, that's pretty much the extent of this question of the possibility of Platonic democracy and Kraut's defense of it. You might raise further concerns. So the question of who would set up this program of special training for leadership, and how we'd sort the good ones from the bad ones. How do we determine whether somebody is too psychopathic or too racist to continue participating? Those might present genuine practical challenges to Kraut's proposal. So do pipe up about those practical concerns you have in the discussion boards or in the comments. You might also just wonder about the kind of story that Kraut is laying out here about this perfect world where we shift from contemporary democracy to his preferred Platonic democracy. He suggests that, maybe we could have sort of a noble-minded group of people who would try to put partisanship aside, and eventually they would lead by example and convince people who are not well enough informed to stay home and not vote, and incrementally the voting age would be restricted further and further until it's only allowed for well-trained 50 to 60-year-olds. There's one question about whether this story is psychologically plausible. I also wonder about whether it's something that we would actually hope could happen, or whether it seems like a nice story. It always strikes me that stories about the limiting of people's rights don't have as rosy a tone as what Kraut envisions on page 87. So that'll be something that we can also discuss as we dig deeper into Kraut's arguments in the discussion boards. So here's perhaps another strategy for objecting to Kraut's proposal of a Platonic democracy. This objection says it may be the case that a Platonic democracy is better at promoting the public good, but the reason why we should continue to have standard egalitarian non-Platonic democracy is that it's inherently more fair to let people have a say in political decision-making. And when we say the people, we mean everybody. And a big part of this is what we saw in Rawls, right? We want to have a set of principles that we would agree to independently of our position in society. So it would be the policy that we would arrive at from the original position that is behind the veil of ignorance. Kraut points out, or he attempts to make the argument, that fairness actually permits a Platonic democracy. So he points out, nobody is barred from the education required in New Callipolis. We might try to draw an analogy between voting and driving. It's no injustice that we disallow certain people from operating motor vehicles because they lack the capability to operate them safely, right? As long as nobody in particular is barred from gaining the skills required to participate in democracy, it's just as reasonable as putting a skill restriction or a testing restriction on something like driving. He also points out that a meritocratic thought, which is part of fairness, meritocracy is just we give certain goods to the people who are most deserving or those with the most merit. So it's completely fair to treat unequals unequally. So it's completely fair to put the best into the hands of experts. We also point out that actual governments leave difficult decisions to experts. So we leave difficult policy and public safety decisions to bureaucrats, and we don't seem to have any problem with it there. And finally, remember we talked about Rawls in terms of the principles that we would choose behind the veil of ignorance. Rawls, Kraut thinks, could require that we demand competent leaders rather than rule by people in general. Or we might even think that Rawls' notion of fairness could require restricting the provision of any political power, that is, the power to vote, to those who are deemed competent. I think that there are questions here, right? One thing that Rawls showed us, and which came up when we read Rawls earlier in the semester, is that he thinks that there's a lexical ordering of the two biggest principles of justice, the principle of equal liberty and the difference principle. And he says that if there's ever a conflict between the difference principle, which is about well-being, quite possibly related to the common good, Rawls does claim that we cannot make sacrifices to our basic liberties. And the one thing that we would agree to from behind the veil of ignorance is the greatest amount of basic liberties, and that no amount of extra provision of self-interest from behind the veil allows for any trade-off. So I think that maybe Kraut is making a contentious claim here because he doesn't seem to acknowledge or account for Rawls's claim that there's a lexical ordering where basic liberties take priority. But that's something that we can think about a little further. Let's look to yet another objection. So beyond fairness, it's sometimes argued that there's a certain kind of wisdom of crowds that democracy is able to capture. So we say we prefer democracy because it, in fact, is able to make better decisions than an aristocracy would. So Aristotle made the point that a group of people could collectively have more money than the richest individual. Well, in a similar way, a group of less wise people could collectively have more wisdom than the wisest individual. So the thought here is just that by having everyone participate in the political decision-making, we might be able to pool all of our talents and do better than any specially chosen aristocracy might do. Centuries later, Condorcet argued, Marquis de Condorcet, argued that the opinions of a group of voters is actually more likely to make a correct decision than a single individual. And the larger the group, the more accurate their decision will be. And Francis Galton in the 20th century pointed out that a crowd did a better job of guessing the weight of an ox, and that's like a dressed ox after being butchered. So an entire crowd did a better job of guessing the weight of this dressed ox than a more specialized group involving farmers and butchers. So by getting more opinions into the mix, the mean guess actually approximated it better. Psychologists have done similar experiments when it comes to things like counting jelly beans in a jar, that the average answer is usually better than a vast majority of individual answers. So there's something about when we have group decision-making, this pooled collective decision-making can demonstrate more wisdom than any particular individual, and the more people you bring in, the more accurate the decision will be. So Kraut has replies to this argument. Kraut denies that we will actually get wiser decisions when we bring more people into decision-making. So against Condorcet, Kraut points out that it's unclear whether there's a good analogy between voting and Condorcet's theorem, because Condorcet's theorem needs the assumption that accuracy is more than likely. So in order for accuracy to accumulate in collective decision-making, they have to have a better than chance shot of getting things right. And if members of the group don't have a better than chance shot of getting things right, well then error will accumulate rather than accuracy. Galton's point that this crowd did a better job of guessing the weight of an ox. Well, Kraut says that either there's no such thing as expertise in guessing the weight of an ox, or there are other cases where expert opinion is going to be more trustworthy than the opinion of the folk in general. So asking a question about basic physics, you're more likely to get a correct answer from the American Physics Association as opposed to a poll of ordinary people. So expert political opinion can't be written off in the same way, especially if we accept Plato's suggestion that leadership and governance is a craft, is one of these roles that you need certain qualifications to do. Moreover, you might think that what we're doing when we engage in political deliberation is we have a bunch of candidates, all of whom are actually qualified to govern, and who then are chosen by the general population. If the thought is that governance is actually only going to work and be justifiable if we're just picking among the experts, then we've kind of granted Plato's central point that rulership should be limited to only the experts. Okay, so we see that Kraut has some Plato-inspired defenses of Platonic democracy against some standard objection, both fairness and the wisdom of crowds. Just a couple final points in defense of Platonic democracy that Kraut makes. One is that ordinary voters tend to vote along partisan lines instead of in the interest of public good. So the thought is people vote in terms of what's going to get them the most money. Oftentimes they vote simply in terms of what's going to apparently benefit their own social group, and that they're not making any genuine attempt at promoting the public good. And if that's the case, we really shouldn't expect voters' preferences to aggregate in favor of the public good. Now, Kraut's point about the special program of training that we would require participants in the political process to undergo, that sort of program would, according to Kraut, make these people sufficiently sensitive to the public good. This wouldn't just be an education in economics or reasoning or mathematics, but it would also involve a certain kind of moral education where these future leaders would have to engage with literature and moral philosophy and be sensitive in the way that they think about history. So he thinks that the general public is not necessarily all that good at promoting the public good. Next, he points out that when it comes to selection of judges in the way that we set up a state, requires a certain kind of knowledge of how jurisprudence work. More specifically, he claims that judges must understand the open texture of language. So it's not just about applying particular laws to particular cases, but Kraut suggests that real jurisprudence, the real skill of being a judge, is about understanding the open texture of language. So the one fun example that he gives is if you have a rule that says no vehicles are allowed in the park, we then wonder about how that rule applies to things like ride-on lawnmowers or ambulances, right? So Kraut's thought here is just that it's unlikely that the public will have the required understanding of how legal philosophy works in order to choose wisely. So the thought here is that if we really want good governance, we need to make sure that decision-making is undertaken by those with a certain amount of philosophical wisdom. So, just to sum up, here's the argument from earlier. Remember, it's about promoting the common good and filling those roles with people who are qualified, right? Ruling is a role that we need to have qualified people in order to promote the common good. And most citizens are going to lack the qualifications necessary for rulership. In democracy, we shouldn't expect ordinary people to be fit for rulership. So the people, that is most people, should not rule. And that's, in his suggestion, maybe not just not hold public office, but also shouldn't be allowed to vote, and that we should leave that to those who have the best chance of making wise decisions. So we'll leave it there for today. I guess it'll be up to you to figure out whether this argument is successful. If it's unsuccessful, you need to show me at least why one of these premises is unlikely to be true. We might also wonder, and this is just to foreshadow some places that we're going to go in this unit, does the fact that citizens lack qualifications for rulership is the solution to that problem to restrict the vote from them? It seems that another way we could approach this problem is to educate more people with more wisdom rather than restricting the scope to only the wise people that we've currently acquired. So we'll leave with that thought. Thanks, as always, for listening in. And I'll look forward to hearing what you think about Kraut's paper. Okay, thanks very much. Take care.